Ladies and gentlemen, aspiring professionals, welcome to the fifth episode of the 12-Man podcast. Today, we re-enter the realm of sports journalism with a real veteran of the industry, Richard Parr. With his nearly 2 decades of experience in sports journalism, Richard has traversed the globe, covering some of the most prestigious sports events on the planet and lending his expertise to esteemed media outlets such as the CNN World Sport, Al Jazeera, or Sky Sports. Richard, welcome to the 12-Man podcast. Pleasure to have you here.
It's great to be here, Christoph. I like the way that you call me a real veteran. That made me feel really old there.
Sorry about it. That was not the intention to make you feel
No,
sorry.
it's fine. I'm teasing you.
As usual on this podcast, we ask our guests 3 introduction questions to get to know them a bit better, and of course, Richard will be no exception. Richard, I have 3 questions prepared for you to build your profile a little bit for our audience. Are you ready?
Ready.
Let's go. Richard, what did you study in school?
Mathematics with finance, and then I did a master's in multimedia sports journalism.
Okay, what was your first job?
First job ever, I actually worked in a sports store called Sport Soccer, which is now Sports Direct, owned by Mike Ashley. Newcastle fans, don't come at me.
And when it comes to your biggest motivations of why you're doing what you're doing, what would you say is your biggest motivation?
I've always been really passionate and I've always loved sport. So I would say that's the main one.
Richard, as someone with a degree in mathematics and finance, what actually prompted your transition into the realm of sport journalism? Because when you said you have been studying mathematics, it's kind of like what makes you this sort of to switch career in such a scope?
Well, clearly I must hate money, right? No, that's not the reason. I studied mathematics with finance at university because I was always good at maths. It was something which came really easy, but I was never really sure what I wanted to do for a profession other than what was my passion, and that was sports broadcasting. It was to be a sports presenter, a sports reporter. And while I was at university, I had the opportunity to be a radio DJ. And in our final year, after doing a couple of years of just being kind of a silly, almost like faux breakfast host, I decided to do a sports show called Back of the Net. And I loved it. And it was a mix of what we have in the UK here of Gillette Soccer Saturday and Virgin Rock and Roll Football. So it was bringing the latest scores, talking to other friends about what's going on in these games, kind of getting reports from any friends who'd be at matches. And it was really good fun. And so I kind of vowed, let me give myself a year to see how I can do within the sports industry. And then I got on a master's program with Eurosport, where I spent 9 months living in Madrid studying. And then I did a 3-month internship with Eurosport in Paris in their main headquarters. And then I ended up getting a job from Sky Sports straight after that. So it all just kind of rolled on quite quickly. I was kind of very lucky in some ways. I put myself in positions to get luck, but I was lucky as well.
Would you say your mathematical background has influenced your approach to maybe analyzing sports statistically and, let's say, your data-driven storytelling?
No, not at all, because I think the level of mathematics that I was learning at university was so complex, it was so difficult that I don't think you need that kind of information to tell stories about sport. Yeah, there's certain things you could probably use. I think I was always inspired by one story of a guy who nearly won the Fantasy Premier League by creating an algorithm. I think that was incredible, but I don't think your general man on the street is going to want to know about that. What the mathematics with finance has probably affected me the most is I have a very organized brain because of it. I'm very compartmentalized in my thinking, and that's actually been really good as a TV producer, say for CNN, when I'm building rundowns of how long each segment should be, what we should be including, what is the the order. I'm able to kind of use my brain to organize that really well. I wouldn't say I have OCD, but it's almost that obsessive compulsive. I need to get this correct. And I think that's probably the greater effect that mathematics has had rather than necessarily analyzing possession and shots on target and the word which everyone hates, XG.
And XG is, to be honest, one of my favorite statistics when it comes to football. So, but no worries. I'm not gonna take this personal. Uh, Richard, with your extensive background in the international sports coverage, can you maybe share with our audience some memorable experiences or even challenges you've encountered? Because you were reporting on events such as the 2022 World Cup in Qatar or the Euros, Africa Cup of Nations. There's been a lot. But what is for you the most memorable?
I really enjoyed the 2013 Africa Cup of Nations. It was my first time to the continent of Africa, my first time to South Africa. I worked with a correspondent reporter who's a really good friend of mine, Robin Adams. So it was a really good trip, and it was one which did provide challenges. Candidly, CAF and that competition aren't as well organized as some of the competitions like the FIFA World Cup, like the UEFA European Championships. And it isn't all quite as organized as they would be. So, for example, we would turn up into a city and we'd want to speak to the players with Ghana. So you try and get a hold of the press officer. By the time you get through to him, he's like, "Well, come to the hotel. See you, bye." And you're like, "Where's the hotel? What time? Who are we speaking to?" And yeah, it was one of those tournaments where, with persistence and hard work, these things would pay off. So this was in 2013, and we did get to the hotel, and the players were just kind of walking around, and we ended up speaking to the manager, speaking to the star player at the time, Asamoah Gyan, who not long before in that 2010 World Cup was one of the stars for Ghana, and it all kind of worked well. It worked all right. So it was a really fun trip, and I got to see 3, 4 different cities of the country, and I actually fell in love with the country, and I've been back 3 times since to Cape Town. So I think that's probably been my favorite, most memorable. Most recently, covering the 2022 FIFA World Cup, that was my first World Cup as well to cover on the ground. And it was back in a country I spent 7 years of my life in Qatar when I worked for Al Jazeera. So that was really good to kind of see how the tournament came together. I had my doubts. I'd been there when the city was probably a quarter of the size it is now, and to see it go off so well, I was really impressed. But also, I was at the final, and that was one of the greatest games ever, and it was my 40th birthday. So what a way for a veteran sportscaster to celebrate his birthday.
I mean, now I'm getting a bit jealous, to be honest. Knowing that you got to see this game, seeing Messi lifting the World Cup trophy, and I mean, what a game it was. So, what a way to celebrate a birthday, right? Richard, you've kind of touched it already. When it comes to all the countries you worked in, we've talked about Qatar that you lived there. Also, you've covered something in Africa, France, Spain. Have you observed any regional differences in sports journalism when it comes to these countries' approaches?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say massively, mainly because the UK and the British sports media is so far reaching that it does touch so many countries. And the Premier League is partly responsible for this, if not mainly responsible for this. So a lot of these different countries aspire to have the same level of coverage that is here in the UK. So I think they try to do it in a kind of similar way. I think the main thing I would notice more than anything is just how different countries will more show their passion. I think the British way, the British people are quite reserved, but people in different countries are just so passionate about their sport and they're not afraid to show it in their broadcasting, in their journalism. And, there's kind of this unwritten rule that in the UK, if you go to a football game and you're in the press box, you shouldn't really celebrate. You shouldn't really be jumping up and down if your team scores. The Africa Cup of Nations, for example, I was at I think it was a Nigeria game, and their journalists were just jumping up and down like they were in the stands. They were just happy to show their joy, and I think there's something kind of sweet about that. I know when I first started doing this job, I was a bit quiet, reserved at mentioning maybe who I supported or anything like that. And I think ultimately you have to remember that we all do this because we absolutely adore sport. We love sport. And in fact, if I'm being honest, if you don't love or adore sport, you shouldn't really be in the industry because there's so many people who would love to have your job.
Very true. Let's jump off a bit because you said in the beginning you were very very careful about saying who you actually support. So who do you actually support? What's your favorite club?
So I'm a Brighton and Hove Albion fan. It's where I'm from. I went to the Goldstone ground when I was very little and followed the team to Gillingham and then at Withdean. And now we have this beautiful stadium in Falmer and now a team to match to the quality of the stadium with a fantastic manager. We're on a pretty bad run of form right now as I speak to you today. I'm not sure when this podcast will go out, but we're also still in the Europa League, which for someone who grew up with Brighton in the second, third, fourth tiers of English football, to see your side beat Ajax, beat Marseille, play Roma, it's stuff of dreams, really.
Very much true, especially the thing about beating Ajax. The game I've been to, and what a dreadful performance from our Amsterdam boys it was. It was absolutely crazy. So I'll give you the credits for that. You guys were very good when it comes to actually beating the top European sides. Not like Ajax is a top side this season, but 3 years ago used to be a bit different. Richard, in addition to your roles as a presenter, commentator, reporter, writer, you do quite a lot. You've also dabbled in even hosting, moderating, and I also saw even stand up comedy. How would you say that this diverse skill set complements, or these skills that complement each other in your career? And do you find that they enhance your versatility as a sports journalist?
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether it's a good thing or a bad thing at times. I think it is a good thing. I think there is often, they always say in America, the riches is in the niches. So having a more niche interest can help. I'm a big wrestling fan as well. So having that niche interest has given me the opportunity to interview wrestlers for Sky Sports, be a ring announcer for Qatar Pro Wrestling, be a commentator for Eurosport. And if it wasn't something which is a little bit more less mainstream, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to speak to some top stars and really refine my interviewing skills. Because everyone wants to interview Mbappe and Messi and people like that, and it's just not as easy as that because everyone wants their time. With the comedy was something I always wanted to do to try and improve my presenting and reporting skills. And I would say it's a completely different skill set. The art of writing your own jokes, performing your own jokes. It's very easy for me to talk to people on a podcast, like I'm enjoying this conversation, talking to a room full of people, talking to a stadium full of wrestling fans. There's no problem in that. But trying to get people to laugh, and I mean, it could be a room of 5 or 50 or 150, is the hardest thing I've ever done. Because when you are just broadcasting, you're just giving information. When you're working or being a stand up comedian, you have to make them laugh at the end of every other sentence. And when they don't laugh, those 2 seconds feels like 3 minutes, and it's heartbreaking and it's horrifying. But the reason I did do it was to try and improve my broadcasting, and I think it has helped, and I think it has made me more more comfortable and more confident of talking to people. And I do like the fact, I am proud of the fact that I do have so many different skills. You know, I can produce, I can edit. I was recently editing highlights for Chelsea for their Carabao Cup defeat. I think that's had like nearly 1 million views. I've done reporting, which is great to be on site. I covered an international match between Uruguay and Spain. I've covered the WTA Championship finals. I've covered the end of season race to Dubai, golf event in Dubai, and these are fantastic things. And I I kind of love it. That's to do the different things just keeps me engaged. It keeps me interested. If I was to have a dream of one thing I could do all the time, it would probably be the reporting. I think being on site, meeting the stars, bringing the atmosphere of what's going on the ground is probably my favorite thing to do. But with the sports industry, it's so competitive. You know, you have to take your opportunities where you can get it. And so I think if you have a diverse set of skills, you have more opportunities to still be involved in the industry and getting close to what you love, which is sport.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear because usually when you speak to people who are involved in the sports industry, they are very much they have a specific niche in which they are involved in, and then when you obviously covering all of these different sort of sports, it's again brings I think a different overview, a bit of a different insight into how sports journalism can also be done. So thank you for that. You've already mentioned some interviews. Would you be able to think of any athletes that you've interviewed and it was really, really something that went down the memory lane?
Good or bad?
Uh, Both. Let's go. Let's do both.
Bad was Mark Cavendish, the cyclist. He wasn't really in the mood to do the interviews. This was at a Qatar, I can't remember what it was called, but it was a cycling event in Qatar, Tour of Qatar, that's it. And it wasn't the best organized, and we were hoping to get some interviews. And it wasn't long after everything that had happened with Lance Armstrong admitting that he'd taken performance enhancing drugs and everything like that. So all of the riders were pretty nervous. But effectively, all of the journalists were told you can just go up to any any athlete, any cyclist before the race and just talk to them, which I'm not sure is the best approach because they're all ready to do a race. I know the Tour of Qatar isn't a massive one, but we approached a few different cyclists, and I found him a bit abrasive, a bit rude, and immediately he said he didn't want to talk about, I think it was the changes within the governing body, the UCI. Obviously, didn't want to talk about Armstrong. And I think I made a mistake of why he didn't win the Tour of Qatar the year before, and that's on me. And he didn't enjoy that at all. But then all of the other questions I gave him, he kind of answered very kind of sarcastically. He'd changed teams during the between the seasons, and I said, "Well, what have been the main differences since you've moved teams?" And he just went, "One wears blue and white, and the other wears all black." And it was just so unnecessary. It just needed to play the game a little bit, and so that's probably one of the most memorable for all of the wrong reasons. What about for the best reasons? I've been very lucky at speaking to some people. George Foreman, the boxer, I always think that was a really good interview. Speaking to him not only about being a boxer, but his George Foreman grills. Speaking to the Brighton players before the World Cup, Alexis McAllister, him talking about how he first met Lionel Messi, and we did that for CNN, but the content got syndicated with BR Football as well, and I think it got like nearly 4 million views in the end, and kind of went a bit viral. Again, all in the lead up to the World Cup, and then he obviously won the World Cup with Argentina, and there's a great picture, a great bit of video of when he returned back to Brighton. He's leaving the training ground with his medal, and the kid is like, "Oh, can I see your medal?" And McAllister lets him kind of put it on, wear it, has a photo with it. I just thought, hey, that's brave of McAllister to let a fan do that. But just what a nice guy he was, and he was a real pleasure to interview. Like I spoke to quite a few of the Brighton players on that shoot. The players like Matoma, Caicedo now at Chelsea, Trossard now at Arsenal, and they were all lovely. But McAllister was just such a nice guy. So it's always good when good things happen to good people, you know.
Indeed. I can definitely agree with that. Richard, when it comes to the industry, obviously building strong connections and strong contacts is essential. And I think especially in a global sports journalism career like the one of yours. Could you share some insights into how you cultivate and maintain these relationships?
Honestly, it's hard. I'm now freelance. I decided to leave CNN in October, and I'm trying to rebuild my network myself. And a lot of that is on LinkedIn. And I think LinkedIn is a great place. I think LinkedIn is a particularly good place to build contacts for guests for whatever network you might be doing. Could it be for a CNN and Al Jazeera, or if it's like a podcast like yourself on the 12th Man? I saw your podcast through that, and that's how we've connected and come with that. So I think that's a really good way. I think to get into any kind of networking events is always helpful. It's always useful. I think it's probably good for young journalists coming through if there's any major events, any conferences to offer your help and just try to be in the room with people and try to make connections. And I would also say for young people coming through is to offer to do stuff for free, like not for too long, just to get yourself a foot in the door. Almost ask people who work for newspapers or media organizations, hey, can I come and do a week or one day's work experience just so you get your foot in the door? I remember a guy at Sky who I think he came in for 1 week's work experience, and then they said to him, well, do you want to come and do a shift next week, a freelance shift? That one day became a week. Those weeks became months. And now he's had a full-time contract at Sky for years. And that's how things can roll. So there's multiple different ways of you getting into an industry. You don't necessarily need a degree or a master's, but once you can get your foot in the door, it's the best way to keep it. I remember I freelanced at Sky for a good 2 years at Sky Sports News between 2009 and 2011. And I was able to use a friend as a connection to get me back in. I'd worked there previously for a few years, but not for Sky Sports News. He got me the introduction. I did one shift, and then it was just a matter of me always going, have you got any more shifts? Have you got any more shifts? I'm available. I'm available. And then in the end, I was working more than the full-time staff as a freelancer. And so I think it's that I think a good phrase to put is polite persistence. It's about creating these contacts, following up with them, and but also like showing an interest in what they're doing. Don't just make it all about yourself. If you start saying, "Oh, I've done this, I've done that, I know this, I know that," no, it's like, what can I do to help you? Do you need any help? What can I do? Where can I be of service to you? People are more because everyone's selfish when it comes down to it. So it's a matter of you trying to help them, and then the opportunities will come. And again, if you're passionate and interested about sport, talk about what you're passionate and interested with about. Find out what the person you're in touch with, who they support. Like, let's say Christoph, let's say the 12th Man is the biggest podcast in the world. touch wood, it
That would
can
be
and
a
will
dream.
be.
That would be a dream.
Yeah, no, it's a great dream. And let's say someone is desperate to come and be working with you to produce your podcast, produce your social media. The best thing they can do is not, have you got any work, or have you got a job, or I've done this, I've done that. It'd be much better if you say, hey, Christoph, I really liked episode 229 where you got Richard Parr back on. It was really entertaining. And you know what? I actually went to see Ajax a few years ago. What an incredible stadium. What have you made of their season? To like connect with you rather than just, I really like your podcast. I'd be really good on podcasts. Have you got any work? You know, who are you going to give the job to?
True. No, very much true. And that's a very good insight as well that you just put there. Richard, it's almost time to wrap up the podcast, but I do have two more questions. When you look at the scope of the future, the landscape of sports and sports media platforms, especially, is ever evolving, and the landscape of digital technologies is also ever evolving. How do you see the future of sports journalism, especially in terms of content delivery or audience engagement and the integration of these emerging technologies, such as the artificial intelligence or VR or AR even?
I think one of the interesting things is going to be athletes creating and curating their own content. I saw something fantastic on LinkedIn the other day of Chouameni, the Real Madrid midfielder, pretty much having his own chat show. And he had the likes of Stephen Bartlett, Thierry Henry. I think he had a piano player there. He had all kinds of different people. And it was really interesting, really insightful. And so I think a lot of athletes now are getting fed up at the way they're covered by mainstream media, but also see the opportunity to present to audiences things you don't know about them because you don't really know much about a footballer. And I think I'm going to be controversial here. Some footballers are probably pretty boring in the fact that all they know is football. They know about getting up, eating, going to training, resting, playing PlayStation, going to bed, and the same, and going to play a game. And yet there are probably some, such as Chouameni, who are fascinating and interesting. And I think some of them are really going to use social media for their benefit, for their gain. I mentioned professional wrestling. There's a tag team called the Young Bucks, and they created a vlog on YouTube called Being the Elite. And it was following their whole journey across the world, into Japan, across America, and people gained a connection with them because of that. And in the end, they helped create All Elite Wrestling, and they're now one of the biggest tag teams in the world, and they made a lot of money through their YouTube as well. So I think more footballers and more sports stars will do similar. I've tried to do similar with my comedy as well. Check that out, Richard_Parr on YouTube, of following my comedy journey, all of my mistakes and all of the different places I performed. So I think sports people will do more of that and probably create teams because of it. So I do think there's good early opportunities for people getting into the industry to connect themselves with top stars and helping produce their content, because these athletes and these sports stars have the money and they don't want to necessarily spend the time on setting out the studio or doing the editing or posting it to social media. So I think that's a good business opportunity. As far as AR and VR, yeah, I think there'll be more involved, more graphics involved. I would say that football fans in general are very traditional. So I remember about 15 years ago, before BT Sport did it over here, or TNT Sports as it's known now, one season Sky moved the clock from the top to the bottom, and everyone complained. The papers complained, and they moved it back. So I think AR is really interesting, and it's not really come to the fore as quickly as I think many people would have thought in business and technology. So I think that will play a part. I think it'd be fascinating that if you could be watching games and you can almost like hover and click on a player or use your phone to find out some stats or some information. I think that would be good. Or even what'd be really cool is you're watching a game in the stadium, you grab your phone, you hover it, it picks out the player. Let's say it's Simon Adingra for Brighton. You click on Adingra, and then up pops like three of his best goals or other clips that you can kind of watch. That would be cool. Where it's going, I don't know, but I think it's that personal curation. The one thing which I am concerned about is because it's so easy to do filming now and recording on your phones and everything like that. I'm concerned that major broadcasters are going to take slight shortcuts, and where before you would pay for a professional cameraman, you pay for a professional editor, you pay for a professional producer, they're just turning it into like a videographer job and expecting the same service but one person doing the same job. And I also feel that because it's such a competitive market, that the wages and the salaries on offer are undeserving of those roles. That's my slight concern. I've now gone into the freelance market and I've been scouring LinkedIn for work and opportunities. I'm not necessarily looking for a full-time role, and not everywhere shows full-time roles, but I've been pretty surprised at how low some of the salaries are for some full-time roles available, even when they're entry level, knowing that in the UK there's a cost of living crisis. So that's a slight concern I have, but there is definitely opportunity, in my opinion, for people to make their way into the industry a less traditional route.
Okay, it's unfortunately time to wrap up. Richard, our last question that we ask to everyone is the advice giving question. As someone who has worked for all these prominent media networks, what advice would you give to aspiring sport journalists who are looking to break into the industry and establish themselves on maybe on an international scale?
I think I've given a lot of good advice there. I think to be multi-skilled is extremely useful. I think to continue to hone your skill in your own time. I think it's about being good to people. I don't know if you can swear on here, but don't be a pain in the you know what. You know, we work in sport because we love it, so we want to be around people who are nice, who are kind. It doesn't mean you can't work hard. It doesn't mean you can't be determined, but you want to work in good atmospheres. So I think that's one. But yeah, look for opportunities and reach out to people and apply for those jobs which you might not necessarily be qualified for, but you aspire to do. Because what can often happen, I'll give you a very quick example, is I got my job at Al Jazeera the first time as a sports producer because I applied for a job to be a sports reporter. And I knew at the time I didn't have the show reel or the resume or the experience, but I applied for that. And then 9 months later, this guy emailed me back and he said, "Hey, Richard, I know you applied for this job, but I kept your CV on hold, and we now have an opportunity here in Doha as a sports producer. Would you be interested?" First of all, I had to Google where Doha was because I had no idea. And then the opportunity came, and it was as a producer, and they gave me opportunities to report down the line. So just be bold, go for what you want. It'll take time, but then take opportunities where they come. And you know, polite persistence, I think, is one of the best phrases I can use.
Great piece of final advice. Richard, thank you so much for coming on the Italian podcast and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
And thanks to all of you for listening. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on our social media networks and on our preferred podcast platform. And yeah, that's a wrap up. Until next time, keep kicking.